Everyone, in this video we're going to take a look at configuring a view controller inside of a navigation controller. So we'll set up just a basic navigation controller, and we're only looking at it from the storyboard perspective in this video. So just a simple app. By default it has a single view controller on the storyboard, and we want to add a navigation controller. So a couple different ways to add a navigation controller to our app. One is through the library, so we can open the library and we can actually drag a navigation controller on. Now this is really just if we don't have a view controller already set up inside of our storyboard, and it adds kind of the visual navigation controller on the left there with the arrow and the view controller on the right. Well, we already have a view controller set up, so let me show you how to add a navigation controller so that this is embedded within the navigation controller. So I'm going to select the view controller, and I'm going to go up to Editor in the File menu, Embed in Navigation Controller. So Editor, Embed in Navigation Controller. So now we see two visual representations here. One is for the navigation controller and one is for our view controller. This is not really ever shown, it's just representing the navigation controller. We can tell that that this navigation controller is embedded within the navigation controller with this segue. And again, our app starts here at the navigation controller. We call this first view controller that our navigation controller connects to the root view controller. And you can see the segue is a little different in this case. It's just a relationship to root view controller, and the only segue action is an instantiation. Our navigation controller allows us to have a title bar, and the navigation controller itself allows us to configure some general title bar properties, but then each view controller within our navigation controller has its own navigation item that we can configure. And there's a few simple properties like title. So I'll just call this Scene 1, and you can see it shows the title at the top. Then if we add another view controller, that view controller is not embedded in the navigation controller. You can tell there's no segue to it. There's no navigation item added. So what we need to do is we need to take Scene 1 and create some type of way to capture an event and segue into our next navigation controller. So I'm just going to add a button, and I'll just dock it to the top, and 0, 0. I'm going to change some properties. I'll change the font. It's 25 and make it bold. And we'll just label this 2, Scene 2. So in order to create this segue, what we're going to do is we're going to hold down Control, click and drag from the button to our new view controller, and it presents a dialog with all the different types of segues. Show is kind of the default, and what Show does is it allows us to take a view and throw it onto our navigation stack so that it becomes the focus of our app. I think a good analogy is think of a pile of books. So throw a book down on a pile, stand over top of that pile, and what do you see? Well, you see the book that's on top, right? So when our stack of books only has one book or one view controller, we just see that we call it the root view controller. That'd be like the root book. And then segue to another book, so grab another book, throw it on top of the stack. What do we look down on? What would you see? We see the second book. Now pop that book off. What do we see? We see again the initial book, and that's basically what's happening when we segue from Scene 1 to Scene 2. We see the second scene on top, and then when we click the back button and go back to scene 2, it removes this scene 2 from our navigation controller stack and goes back to displaying scene 1 on our phone. One thing is this back button, and by default it shows the title on our storyboard. However, what's displayed is really not that title. What's displayed is actually this back button value, and it might be intuitive to some of you to think like we're in scene 2 and we're configuring the title item, the navigation item for scene 2, so we should change this back button, and that's what's displayed in scene 2. But actually, this back button title by default would be the back button for the scene that it's going to transition back to, if that makes sense. So if we go back to scene 1 and we configure inside of the navigation item, if we configure the back button, like if I said just first scene, you can see that it updates this. It updates this title. And again, this is the back button for scene 1. So if I change this to scene 1, and that makes sense if you think about it this way. Scene 1 could transition to 15 different scenes, or let's consider it transitions to 3 different scenes. So scene 1 transitions to scene 2, scene 3, and scene 4, but we want scene 2, 3, and 4 to have the exact same back button value, and that's why we configure the back button inside scene 1. Okay, let me add another button into scene 2, and we'll add a third view controller. So I'm just going to configure some constraints. I think it was 106, dock to the top, and we'll auto resize the width. I think this was, what, 25 maybe, and bolded. And we'll say 2, scene 3. And then let's add a third navigation controller. I'm sorry, view controller. And again, I'm going to hold down the control button and click and drag, and we want to select a show segue. One other thing that you can configure inside of this, let me add the title. One other thing that we can configure that's really important actually, if we're going to use these segues inside of code, is to add an identifier. So if we say 2, scene 3, and we don't really need these if our app only transitions from the view controller to one single view controller. So if there's only one segue, then we might be alright without these identifiers. But most apps, you'll run into the, I'm sorry, 2, scene 2, I can't talk and type. Most of our apps eventually will have a view controller that segues to more than one scene. And programmatically in our view controller, if I can explain this in an easy way, I guess, is if you're going to transition using a segue from scene 1 to scene 2, you might want to do some like cleanup on scene 1, and you might want to set up some values to pass on to scene 2. We can override a method called prepare, and inside of prepare, you need to know which scene you're transitioning to. So, or in other words, which segue is called. And the way that we do that is with this scene identifier. So you'll have a prepare method, and then it'll say, well, if it's going to scene 2, let's do this. If it's going to scene 3, let's do this, and so on. Okay, so we have navigation controller, and this is our root view controller. We've got this initial setup. Scene 1 is displayed, then we have a button with a segue that goes to scene 2. That would pop scene 2 onto our navigation controller stack. Then we have a button in scene 2 to go to scene 3, and that would pop scene 3 onto our navigation controller stack. If we press this back button, which goes to scene 2, it would, push scene 3, and then we would pop scene 3 off the navigation controller stack with that back button and go back to scene 2. Scene 2 is displayed on the phone now. Then we click this back button, which goes to scene 1. It's going to pop scene 2 off of our navigation controller stack and now display scene 1. So let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so we load our app and that navigation controller is loaded and we have our root view controller displayed. So our root view controller is scene 1. Now we're going to click on this button and it'll do a push segue. By default, the transition from scene 1 to scene 2 with that push segue is it's going to slide from right to left. Now we've displayed scene 2. So scene 2 is now on top of our navigation controller stack. Now we're going to click on to scene 3. Scene 3 is now pushed onto our navigation controller stack. Now we click back to scene 2. We pop scene 3 off in that case, and now scene 2 is displayed. Again, we pop scene 2 off, and now scene 1 is displayed. So the navigation controller is keeping a programmatic stack of all of these view controllers. And it allows us to navigate between each of our scenes. So that's the basic setup for a navigation controller. Later on we'll take a look at some things we can do programmatically behind the scenes to prepare to transition using that push segue or to pass values between the view controllers and even store some values with a custom navigation controller class. Thanks.